on Medium, so keep an eye on your socials in the coming weeks for that. And then finally, we also invite you to be active in the chat throughout the presentation. So feel free to introduce yourself, connect with each other, ask questions. This really is your session, so the chat is a great way to engage and make sure that we're getting the most of our time together. Okay, so I think we're ready to get started with our first panelist. I'll introduce Nicolas Grossman. He's joining us from the Global Data Barometer core team as a research and data lead, and recently joined the Global Index on Responsible AI. For more than 6 years, Nicolas has led the open data and data journalism strategy of one of the most well-recognized private sector platforms using open data in Latin America. You may have seen him present before at many open data events in Argentina and Latin America, or at a data journalism workshop, which he has hosted for some of the most important newsrooms in Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Nicolas is currently studying the challenges and risks of big data and AI from the perspective of less developed countries for his master's studies in international political sociology. Nicolas, thank you so much for being here, and the virtual floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation here. And also in behalf of all the Global Data Barometer team, we are very keen to be here talking about the Global Data Barometer, and with a great focus on data governance, data reuse, and the impact on the open data policies. May I share my screen with some slide deck? It's okay for you? Okay, I have no permissions. May I?
Try again, because.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, wait a minute. Okay. And 1 sec. It should be this one. I have an issue here. Can I share with someone the presentation?
Yeah, sure. I can share with you.
Oh, sorry, I have a warning.
Send me
here.
by email. Yes, or if not, send me by email your presentation, and I can share your presentation with the public.
Okay, so sorry, everyone. I start speaking a little bit before we have that presentation. Marcet, I send it to you. Well, our idea for this session is to address and to share with you some of the global data barometer results focused on these issues.
Sorry, Nicolas. Veronica, can you give me permission or floor? I'm not a host. Sorry.
Okay. For those who doesn't know, the Global Data Barometer is the successor of the Open Data Barometer, the global study that tracks open data initiative and data uses all around the world. And the Global Data Barometer first edition was designed with different approach, conceptual different approach, and also methodological differences. The main conceptual difference is that the Global Data Barometer is tracking, the main concept is data for public good. It's not only open data, but it tries to go beyond that concept and see other ways data is being shared, released, and governed in different countries. And then, among many other different methodological approaches, we have what we call the thematic lenses, where we have a deep analysis in sectorial data ecosystem, for example, land data, political integrity data, company information, etc. And well, as you may know, recently, a few weeks ago, we have released the results of the Global Data Barometer. And the Global Data Barometer is composed by 4 main pillars that are the 4 main dimensions that inform the final score. This is data governance, data capabilities, data use and impact, and the availability of data and different data sets. Today, we are going to focus on some results and analysis from the pillars of the data governance and the data reuse. To understand a little bit how we can use the Global Data Barometer data to inform and to improve open data policies, it is important to know that we have collected data from what we call the core governance modules, that they are indicators that collect evidence and assess countries at a general level. And then we have the thematic governance indicators that assess the sectoral data governance. For example, thematic governance indicators could be if there is a framework that governs company information data. Is there a mandate that governments should collect and publish this kind of data or not? And a core governance indicator may be, for example, data protection frameworks, also an open data policy, but we also look at other indicators, for example, if there are frameworks to guide how to share data or data management frameworks. And
Nicolas,
yeah.
Sorry, I think you are a host. Can you give me the permission and I can share your screen?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Wait a minute. How do I give you? How do I do that? Ah, there. Right.
Thank you. I'm sorry again.
Okay. Well, where were we? Okay, yes. So first of all, I would like to share with you some insights. Let's go to the 7th one, 6, 7, 8, 7. 7 is okay. The context of the Global Data Barometer. The next one. Right, thank you. And that is a project that under the Data for Development network and was hosted by ILDA in this first edition and mainly funded by IDRC Canada with the additional support from UNFPA. Please, next one. That was good that we got this slide deck because I had forgotten to mention this important institutional arrangement. And then it was also very important to mention that the Global Data Barometer built an international network to do all this research. In the design phase and also in the data collection phase, the regional hubs were very important pieces of this exercise because they were engaged in the designing the indicators, but also as regional organizations or from civil society with a lot of roots in each country, they were in charge of organizing the field work in different countries. And then in the next slide, we are going to see our thematic partners that also were very important in the designing phase of the indicators because they are very experts in their areas and also in understanding the results. So all this effort on designing the indicators and the data collection phase in more than 100 countries gave us very detailed analysis and assessment on more than 1,000 data sets, more than 900 data frameworks. We analyzed more than 70 open data initiatives, and all this together gave us more than 70,000 data points to analyze, to compare, and to understand trends in how data is governed, how data is made available, used, and how are data capabilities throughout the world. And we invite you to go to our website, the globaldatabarometer.org. In the results section, you may find a lot of charts to explore, but also you will find the final report with some very important insight, as well as open data sets to download and make all your analysis. In the next slide, this is the introduction of the governance pillar that I have made with you with a little definition, but we can skip it because we have discussed a little bit this together before what we talk about when we talk about governance. And this analysis on the core governance indicators that in the next slide, we're going to see very brief overview. For example, we had these 4 out of 6 indicators on the core governance module, and where we can see that the more than 70 countries have an open data policy, but only 30 of these policies have the force of law. However, for example, if we go to data protection frameworks, we see that most of them has the force of law, and data sharing and data management also more countries has force of law than open data policy. This could lead to further discussion that we don't have time today. So in the next slide, we would also like to share with you that apart from those analyses, we have assessment for all those frameworks. So there are a lot of analysis that can be made. For example, this is a summary of how many open data policies mandate these characteristics. For example, we found that most of the open data policies assessed establish a common definition of open data, and more than a half requires to publish data in machine readable formats and promotes the open licensing. However, not many of them were requiring the use of specific standards. In the next slide, we are going to see this is not about governance, it's about availability, but there are some characteristics that can be tracked in both. For example, this is an analysis of all the data sets that were assessed, more than 1,000 data sets. And we can see that the characteristics related with openness that are more present there are to be free of charge, they are timely and updated, and in many cases, data is provided in machine readable, but in less cases, data is openly licensed. And in fewer cases, the machine readable dataset is available as a whole. So we can see how it goes from theory, from the open data policies and the requirements, and how it is working in practice. Obviously, this can be broken down in a lot of different aspects with different indicators, but this is just an overview to give you an idea what kind of information we can find and what we can learn from the GDB results. In the next bunch of indicators, we are going to talk about the thematic governance indicators. It's like we are looking for frameworks, laws, guidance, etc., for a specific data set. For example, is there some law, some guidance that requires the publication of public consultation data, of public finance data, lobby data, beneficial ownership, etc. Here in this slide, you can see they are ordered according to the average score. We could also dig a lot on these characteristics as we did with the open data policy, but we don't have time now. But in the next slide, we wanted to focus on one very interesting insight that we found, that is, we have pairs of indicators. One indicator tracking if there is a framework that mandates to publish lobby data, and then we assess if that data set exists in the country, and we did that with the 7 pair of indicators of governance and availability of data. And we found out that there is a clear correlation. So when there is an open data requirement, there are much more possibilities to find an open data set. If there is not mandate to publish data in any form, it's very hard to find data. So it is very important to have the specific frameworks to have the data released in an open way. Then, aware of the time, we are going to go very briefly for the data use and impact pillar of the Global Data Barometer. First of all, some warnings, let's say. We found and we discussed a lot during the design and in a lot of the workshops that were held that measuring use and impact is very challenging in different disciplines. And also it's more challenging if we have to compare results in more than 100 countries. Because of different factors that could be the ability of the researchers, but also how to define the impact in one single year and not with the longitudinal study. That is why this pillar was the smallest in the survey, and also is the pillar that has less weight in the overall score, because we are aware of this methodological challenge that we were piloting these approaches in this first edition, and then we are going to receive feedback on it, so it could be more robust in next editions. And we only had 4 indicators on this pillar that were related to 4 thematic modules. So we were tracking, for one side, of examples of use of data of public procurement, use of data inside the political integrity module, also in the land module, and in the company information. And what we did to try to reduce the margin of error of this indicator is to specify very precise use cases. So in the company information model, we were looking for due diligence, uses of data for due diligence processes. In the land module, we are looking for uses of land data to inform or to try to make a change on land policies toward more inclusive and in equity in land policies. And we brought here 2 main interesting findings that we had with the overall results, is that the data that was most used was the data on procurement data, then political integrity, then land, and lastly, company information that, as we mentioned, was focused on due diligence processes. And the final insight that we wanted to share with you is that, yes, in the next one, is about the users of these data sets. So along with the assessment of the use cases, we were asking if the stakeholders, if the users of this data were identified, and we have that civil society and media are leading the use of data in these sectors. However, academia and private sector were not so present in this assessment. Yeah, and I think, let me think. Yes, we brought here some use cases, some examples. They are in the Global Data Barometer website and in the data sets and in the reports. You will find plenty of examples. This is a very rich repository on how this data is being used. I am very grateful that you let us show this. I hope this was useful. I'm very sorry because of the technical issues that I couldn't share my screen, but I hope that wasn't so annoying for your presence.
Not annoying at all. Thank you very much, Nicolas, for your presentation. We are mindful of the time, so we'll keep things moving along here. But just be mindful that the link for the Global Data Barometer has been put in the chat there by Amy. Speaking of Amy, she is our next panelist. Amy Whitcroft, who is a long-standing member of this working group, is also well known as an advocate for what she calls open X. So that's open data, open government, civic tech, open access, open source, and so on. Within minutes of speaking to Amy, you'll quickly see that she brings a passion to her work and is an active member of the global open data community through her service with Internet New Zealand and as our board member for the Open Data Charter. So welcome, Amy, and take it away.
Kia ora, can you hear me? Hello, saying hello to you from very frosty Otatahi Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But great to be here. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. So fun things. And let's see how we go, because I don't think I've actually shared a screen in Zoom before. So let's see how horribly tragic this gets, how fast. Okay. Okay. It's thinking. Can you see this?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yep. Cool. It's going to be a very simple and short talk, so that if there is time for kororo and questions, and of course afterwards we can talk about it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the transport sector sort of internationally as a use case, predominantly in the EU, because that's where some of the most research is. And then at the end, I'm going to be closing off with sort of some of the gaps and the challenges and things that I've seen. This started because I have up until recently been working in the transport sector here in New Zealand. And so I was looking to just think about, and was asked to think about sort of how do we start to measure value and impact of open data to the transport sector. So that's predominantly going to be transport related open data, everything from, I don't know, pavement conditions to motor vehicle registries to crash statistics to traffic counts, all of that kind of stuff. I spent a few years in the sector. And just sort of what I learned in trying to start figuring that out. I'm just starting to time myself as well. Okay, so the quick reminder, we'll all know this. I'm sure we basically have it tattooed on ourselves, but for anybody who might be joining us for the first time, just a reminder so that we're on the same page, that open data is data that anyone can use anywhere, anytime. So it's not limited geographically or in terms of the time that it's available or anything like that. Of course, you generally are going to need machines that can process the data and access to the internet, but fundamentally that's it. It should also be machine readable as well as human readable. So things like most images and PDFs don't count because they're not machine readable, right? I know that's changing with some modern AI and things, but nonetheless, we'll go with that as sort of the basics. So talking about transport data very specifically here, I'm just going to dive in. And again, this has been pulled out of some really good research reports that have been written in the last few years, the next few slides. So transport data is, as it says here, one of the EDP's, the European Data Portal's sort of most valuable data sets or sets of data sets. It's really highly used. There's high growth potential linked to it. There's a lot of it. And it does all kinds of cool things. So here, basically it says what it does in the bullet points, and I'll go through some examples of each of these shortly. So it's a very direct cause for economic sort of growth and innovation and employment, like absolutely directly. It can save lives. It can produce people's service experience. It can reduce costs across a whole bunch of domains. So labor, time, environment, social, pick a domain. It can probably help to sort of reduce bad stuff and help enable good stuff. And yeah, overall, it acts as an enabler for a whole bunch of other things, sort of more indirectly as well as directly. Am I speaking too fast? No, cool. All right, I know sometimes I start going, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so a couple of examples of where open transport data has been shown to be a direct cause of, as I said, economic growth and innovation and employment. We all know the Transport for London, well, possibly we don't, but Transport for London gets used a lot as one of the exemplars of where this has been useful. So Transport for London kind of does what it says in the box. And a number of years ago, they decided to start releasing open data. It's been estimated, and this was in 2017, because I got research done around it, to be generating benefits of up to £130 million a year. And this is just off the open data released as APIs by one organization. It did a whole bunch of things as well. So you can imagine that because people were able to come up with a whole bunch of apps, 600 odd apps, some of them around more accurate journey planning. It helped reduce wait times. And delays and things. For those of you who've ever used the London transport system, sometimes you can spend a very long time sitting in the freezing cold waiting for trains, for example, not knowing where they are. And what it also did, and this is one of the amazing things that you can do with open data, is you can start to form partnerships with other organizations who will use your data, but then they'll feed you back data that you may not necessarily have or be able to collect, or because limited resources. And it's done as a partnership. And that's exactly what happened here. So the data fed back into TfL further helped them sort of understand what was going on and helped improve their operations. So that would be reducing costs or improving efficiency. There's a whole range of stuff. There are reports about it. Another couple of examples come from the EU. So these are just some fun numbers. I mean, we're data people after all, but hopefully this is sort of warmish data and comes with context. So that's, just over 1 million open data employees in the EU in 2019. Now that's direct and indirect. So people directly employed to work with open data or on open data, but also indirect. So people whose jobs aren't focused on open data and would survive without it, but where open data really enriches the work that they do. And as you can see, that goes up to about 2 million open data employees forecast in 2025. And that's quite a recent forecast. That's from like 2020. So that's quite up-to-date information. And then, as you can see here, we're looking at billions and billions and billions of just euros that are being generated by the open data ecosystem. As you can imagine, that expands out massively. If you look at other countries and other sectors, that's just for transport and trade. I've seen, sort of hundreds and hundreds of billions being touted as what open data can generate in terms of value for example, the EU. There are some other benefits. So, for example, a means to save lives. I had thought about it in terms of previously like crash statistics. If you understand where the crashes are happening and you start to look at weather data and things like that, you may be able to come up with a way to improve road quality or speed limits or whatever it is. But there are other ways to do it. So, for example, thousands of lives could be saved by emergency services arriving slightly faster, which makes sense. Another one, and I find this particularly interesting, is that using things like sort of real-time mapping and just real-time information, first responders could get onto the scene of incidents much faster than potentially, the official emergency services are. So there have been apps where basically first responders get a ping on their phone if something terrible has happened, and it routes it to the people who are closest, and they're able to get there really, really, really quickly to keep the person going, basically, until sort of hardcore help can arrive. So that's quite interesting. There are other things I mentioned previously, being able to reduce delays in waiting times, for example. You're looking at millions of hours, tens of millions of hours saved. Again, this is in the EU alone. Now you can imagine what you can do with all of that time that's not being wasted anymore, right? People could live fuller and richer lives and not be sat around freezing on train platforms. And there's also things like reducing the amount of time that people are stuck in traffic, because of course, if you've got much better routing services, whatever it is that you happen to use, less time stuck in traffic, that's great. That saves you time, but think about all of those emissions that you're saving. Think about all of that air pollution that you're not generating, that noise pollution that you're not generating. So there you can see all of those costs that sort of have been stacking up with traffic jams that then start to de-stack. So the other thing is, you can think of it as an enabler. So those are some direct things that open transport data can do. But if you think about it, data isn't, it's kind of like the tech sector in general. People have tended to think of it as a silo, and it's not. It's infrastructure. It runs horizontally underneath and through and across absolutely everything else. So there are as many use cases for open data as there are people with imaginations and needs for it. I mean, the sky's kind of the limit on this one. And it also does things like contribute to skill and sort of process transformation, because once the data is there and available, there is so much more reason for people to learn how to deal with that data and what to do with it, how to analyze it, how to share it. And yeah, basically how to everybody to level up. And it enables people like third-party intermediaries to spring up, like data intermediaries. The Open Data Institute talks about this. So you get all of these kinds of enablers. And even if you're not using the data per se, there is very likely something being generated in the system that either directly or indirectly benefits you. But this is why it's really so difficult, and I'll get onto this a little bit more shortly. It's really not simple to measure sort of impact or value creation. I'm sure many of us have heard various managers and executives and stuff go, we're making this stuff, you just have to tell us what the impact is, with the clear implication being that otherwise we're going to stop doing it because we don't understand what the return on investment is. But because it has all of these enabling effects, and many of them are second order, third order, they're downstream, they're indirect, it can be really, really, really difficult to understand it. Also, it's often going to be used for purposes that you don't see because they're pro bono or they're social. So there isn't a value, there's not money directly being generated from them. It's different if you've got, like, I don't know, number of lives saved, for example, or businesses and they generated this profit off it, but it's not always that easy. So a little bit more on that. This, because I've been researching this, it's very much an unsolved problem, right? The open data movement has been going for some time now. And more people are, it's a maturity journey thing, right? More and more people are going, look, it is important that we're able to demonstrate at least some impact, some value. It's not enough to just go, well, we think, but we don't know. So I do understand that. It's very, very, very complex. Where I've been able to see people do it, they've tended to be sort of once-off, very large, very expensive studies that have been done. It's not an ongoing process, where you can just sort of pull stuff down, go and check in every month or so. Well, it's not that simple, and see what's happening. Of course, value and impact need to be quite heavily defined as well, and that's going to differ by organization, by geography, by culture, and in a whole lot of other ways. As I said, it's expensive, so often the funding isn't there to do it. So, people might say, please go off and do it. And you're like, but what you're asking is the work of 2 to 3 people minimum for possibly a year, full time. If they were doing this across a larger region, certainly, are you going to fund that? And I go, no, please just do this as, one person as part of your job. And that's really difficult to do. I've certainly wrestled with that. As I said, a lot of it is sort of downstream, it's indirect, and value and impact also aren't always based on financial numbers or numbers. A lot of it is contextual, is, how did it improve people's well-being? How did it improve people's quality of life? You can't necessarily stick a number on that. I'm not sure you should. There's also a tendency to just look at simple things like web metrics, number of visitors or whatever. I try and push back against that. It's useful context indicatively for some things, but it's also incredibly dangerous, and has a whole bunch of very perverse incentives built into it if one goes down that road without being careful. So, and then of course, how do we build in other things like data equity and indigenous data sovereignty and things like that? Because remember that open data can potentially cause harms as well. And it's not just privacy breaches. And the indigenous data sovereignty crowd are fantastic with whom to speak about some of that, which possibly we don't always think about. So sort of my provocation here is, are we asking the wrong questions then in trying to pin down numbers and financial numbers on what open data is and what it can do? It's an open question. There's lots of really interesting writing about this. Some of it ranty. I'm going to write really ranty stuff about this at some point. So yeah, I mean, my suggestion would be, so I started doing this while I was still involved in the transport sector, and I'm happy to keep working on it, but basically come up with kind of a toolkit. I know that the Open Data Charter is really good at toolkits, but basically that pulls together both materials that people can present to their stakeholders to say, these are the challenges of what you're asking us to do, but also this is what we know so far across any sector or more generally. But also case studies, research methodologies, lessons learned. Hey, we tried this, and this is what we learned, and this is why we do or don't do it, and this is what we're going to do next. But somewhere where we could sort of all go and where we could contribute, and that we could contribute to learn from each other. In the course of this, I had some wonderful conversations with folks like, for example, Wilfrida, to say, hey, what are you doing with your open data portal, and how are you measuring impact? And I started pulling together a whole bunch of sort of different ways to do that again before I left the sector, but the thinking is still there. And the other reason is that something like this might help to provide a bit of interoperability across different regions' work. As we would have heard with the Global Data Barometer, that can be so difficult. because everyone's got different, not only data standards, but understandings of concepts. So how do we start? I'm not saying we standardize like at all, but it might provide us ways to start going, if we're not reinventing wheels all the time, we may be able to, not reinvent wheels and generate like a whole bunch more, funnily enough, value and impact out of the value and impact work. So that's kind of my brief spiel. These slides will be shared. Here are the next couple of pages are just some fun case studies from the European Data Portal. There's hundreds and hundreds of these just on the European Data Portal of what people have done in terms of case studies. And it's such a wide range of stuff. And this was just for transport. But yeah, and there are links there. They're in the slides as well. You'll notice that I've footnoted things. But if y'all want other links, I'm quite happy to sort of root through my various research places and find stuff for you. So yeah, that's me. How did I do for time? Ugh, sorry, slightly over.
We're a little behind schedule, so we're gonna move it right along to Dr. Gregory Richards. Thank you so much, Amy. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some questions and some comments. Greg is joining us from the University of Ottawa. He holds a PhD and an MBA and is a certified management consultant. He brings an extensive knowledge on how to use public sector data and how it can influence program outcomes. He is the Vice Dean of Graduate Professional Studies at the university and has been in the consulting services working with the Government of Canada more recently as we speak, in fact, and with the US for the past 20 years. So thank you. I'm so thrilled that you're here with us today, Greg. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Wilfrida. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Nicola and Amy. Amy, great jumping off point for this presentation. My experience in open data, my students have actually been using open data for some time. Amy on the transport side, we worked with our Ottawa police to help them figure out how to avoid traffic accidents and so on and so forth. So this project is being done with the group at Trojan Board, and thank you to Wilfrida and her team for putting up with me as I work through the research. So assessing impact, some key principles that we adopted. One, research-based, so that there is sound support for the approaches that we plan to take. What I like to call objectively verifiable data. There are lots and lots of case studies out there, as you mentioned, Amy, 100%. What we would like to do is to be able to use data to assess impact that anyone who looks at it will draw basically the same conclusion. That's not often easy to do with qualitative data, and then easily explainable. When we do have to justify expenditures to whomever we have to justify them to, complex explanations don't often work. So far, what the research says, a lot of survey data, as both of you have pointed out, a lot of anecdotes that confirm specific instances, a few quantitative studies available. So that's really what the focus is for the research that we're doing. Assessment matrix. So there is good consensus in the literature that on the left side, the 3 benefits you see in the rows are generally benefits that accrue from the use of open data. We've divided them into 2 levels for economic efficiency gains and gross regional domestic product. At level 2, social lifestyle decisions. Level 2, quality of life indicators, and then political engagement. And then at level 2, strengthened democracy. Of course, those are extremely difficult to measure, as you mentioned, Amy. So a bit more detail, economic level 1. Looking here at the dollar value of efficiencies gained divided by the total investment in OGD publishing. This is obviously for the publisher of the OGD data. If that ratio is greater than 1, then the benefit cost works out, and you should move forward with it. The approach is from Tatjana Penisevic in Sweden, who actually did some of this work with municipalities in Sweden. The blue box at the top estimated the current labor cost, estimate the change in labor before and after publication of open data, and then the total cost of the setup for the open data. So there are some examples of this being done with enough research and enough objectively verifiable data so that we can actually start to talk about validation of some of the data points. Level 2, normally what we do here is economic impact analysis. Again, this is a well-established procedure. This is an IO and input-output model that's used here by Stats Canada. So basically inputs, again, the cost of setting up the open data, direct impact, usually measured in terms of number of employees that are hired for setting up the open data. Indirect impact, now we get an induced impact, we tend to move into more of the economic multipliers. And again, our Stats Canada department publishes these, so there are data out there to be used. This second set kind of shows the basic data sources that we would have to work through to capture the data and then run the calculations. The hard part, of course, is capturing the data. Once we have it, as I mentioned, the economic impact calculations are well established and recognized by many. At the social level, level 1, OGD supports individual decision making. Lots of examples of this, right? Using spatial data or geographic data to find out, where the hospitals are, where the best schools are, where should I buy my house, and things like that. There's lots of individual work going on there. The challenge, of course, is how we do this at the aggregate level. And so quality of life indicators, OECD indicators you see on the screen. The big question is, can you segment specific sectors and ask the question, are we seeing more or less use of open data in those particular segments where quality of life indicators tend to be better? Complex process because you can correlate things, but it doesn't necessarily indicate causality. However, it's I said it's exploratory research, so those are the things we're thinking through. Political, level 1, Ruji and colleagues have identified 3 different levels of political engagement. And certainly this would depend on survey data more than anything else to find out what people are actually doing with open data and whether or not that is driving them towards one of these 3 different levels of engagement. So that would be the first level, where there are actually 3 different things to think about when we think about open data driving political engagement. And we've seen some of the open data in developing countries, case studies out of GovLab and NYU have indicated that there are political engagement happening based on things like exposing or at least publishing information on what's being spent in procurement processes and so on. Level 2 becomes a little bit more complicated. Now the Economist Intelligence Unit has this democracy index that it publishes on a regular basis. This is their latest, 2016, the world's strongest democracies. On the bottom, it's not good news. It's falling. I think it's being actually pulled down by the US more than anything else, to be honest with you, but I don't have any data to support that, but that's a theory. So level 2 would be looking at the strengthening of the democracy. And conceptually, one can imagine that the more that we publish this data, the more transparency there is, the more faith there is in our democratic institutions. And then if you ask the question, Nicolas, this is from when it used to be the Open Data Barometer. So, you might ask the question, do we see any kind of overlap, so to speak, between countries that are doing very well with open data and countries that are doing very well in terms of strengthening democracy? Again, a correlation kind of conversation, but there may be ways of parsing out the relationships that show that there's some causality involved. So that's where we are, conscious of time. So I zipped through that pretty quickly, but here are some conclusions. One is few impact studies exist. Quantitative impact studies. A common framework would greatly help. And so that's what working with Frida and her team, we've been trying to develop at the 3 levels I mentioned. But we think that initial steps focusing on the economic, level 1 and level 2, level 1, somewhat easier than level 2, obviously. But starting there might provide some evidence and some experiences that will help us move forward to filling out the entire assessment matrix that I showed you on an earlier slide.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's great to see get a sneak peek of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. So we have a few minutes left, and I really want to get some discussion going. So I thought that the question that Amy raised during her presentation is actually a great one that all of our panelists may be able to weigh on. So this question about whether we accept that open data is an enabler and cannot be quantified to the extent of economic value, or do we do the difficult and uncertain work of attempting to measure the value of open data? Isn't enough to speak about it anecdotally, or do we need that number?
I don't think, just jumping in, I don't think it's an either or situation. I think we do need to do the difficult work to quantify where possible. But I think that sometimes there is too much of a drive, especially, dataism is the new religion, to try and put numbers on everything and realize that not everything can or should, possibly it's a should, have a number put against it. There is context to human experience and human value and impact. That is, yeah. So I think it's both. But let's make sure we're asking the right questions before we try and answer them.
Mm-hmm. Greg, Nicolas, anything to add?
I think for me, I just basically come from a point where I try to measure everything, whether or not it's actually measurable. So to your point, Amy, I think at some point we'll tap out with kind of this very quantitative, objectively verifiable kind of measures. But, I love the intellectual challenge of just trying to do it. And I know for sure that the work I've done in public sector organizations, somebody always asks you to justify the money you're spending. So to some degree, if we can get at least halfway there to say, I can show you verifiable data that validates the reasons for this, that's great. But the rest, as you point out, yeah, it may be just a quality of life thing that we'll never be able to measure, but at least we know it's happening.
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree with those point of views. One thing is to think about it pragmatically. Definitely, it needs to be done because it's a way to make things move forward and more projects and more open data out there. But that doesn't have to stop you thinking about more of the moral or the conceptual issues on trying to measure this. So it's okay to have these measurements, but we should be careful that this not has to be the only guide that we take when we are opening data, when we are working with open data. Not only the measures, but take into account, as Amy says, that there are some things that are not in those numbers.
Agreed. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your insights and for your time, and for the answers to that particular question. Before we wrap up, I do want to give an opportunity for our members to ask questions or raise anything that may be top of mind for you over the last month that maybe our panelists can contribute to. Any questions, comments, feedback? We're a shy, quiet bunch today. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. We continue to be available by email if people have questions that they want to raise for the panelists. I'd encourage you to put your email in the chat as well in case people want to reach out over the course of the next month. We'll wrap up there. Thank you all again for your time and wishing you a happy July, and we'll see you next month.
Yes. Happy July, you all. Stay blessed. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Thank you.